My hypothesis for this assignment is if a woman's BMI increases, then their income increases as well. The first time seeing this presentation is the countries generally shift from left to right. That shows women and their GDP. As the countries are moving higher in spending power, their BMI also increases. When studying the correlation between the two variables, I found that countries mirrored each other. Others showed that my hypothesis was partially correct. Then there were outliers, which were the exception, and then most countries that proved my hypothesis to be correct. The first example wheel compares Tanzania and Sudan in Africa, which mirror each other. And at first their GDP falls, but then in the mid-90s it takes a turn where their GDP increases. The reason for Tanzania improving is they had reached a crisis in their economy, which their government set to fix by initiating an economic recovery program starting in 1986. They adjusted their exchange rate, removed importing restrictions, and in 1992 they allowed the citizens to hold foreign currency deposits at domestic banks. In 1994, they kept the exchange rate flexible. We see the positive effects from that since their GDP fell, then ending toward a level 2. This made their BMI for women increase. A similar thing happened in Sudan when they implemented reforms starting in 1997, and they worked with the International Monetary Fund, which helped keep their exchange rate in their favor. Before that, though, in 1983, a civil war occurred, which resulted them in having a dictator in control. This is something we see negatively affect their GDP. And they began to export crude oil in 1999, and a significant amount of that was to China, which drove their economy and helped their GDP and BMI from them, getting them out of a level 1. Next, we'll look at Nicaragua in the Americas. This is an example that shows my hypothesis to be partially correct, where their GDP decreases while their BMI increases, and when the GDP increases, their BMI increases as well. And so we see that the income fell backwards starting in the early 1980s and improving in the mid to late 90s. The Latin American debt crisis was the main reason for their economy failing. There was also a civil war called the Contra War, which made the country unstable. Hyperinflation heavily weighed on the negative effects. What started to turn their economy around is when they received a new government and cut back on military. And from 1997 to 2002, Nicaragua's economy started to recover due to foreign aid, debt forgivenesses, and remittances from abroad. A new leader was appointed in 2006 and focused on improving the lives of poorer citizens. They entered a free trade agreement with the U.S. in 2006, which attracted investment and prompted economic development. In 2007, the country's $1 billion debt was canceled as well. We see the positive effects on their GDP and BMI from a stabilizing government. And the most interesting of the countries to show an outlier is Nauru. They showed my hypothesis to be completely incorrect by starting at a strong income, BMI climbing, and ending at a level 2. And so the story behind this is they drove their wealth from phosphate, which they lost, and what kept them from completely collapsing was a detention center that held Australia's unwanted asylum seekers. 10% of the small island was employed by the center. During the 70s and 80s, the locals grew very rich from mining, making them one of the best economies in the world. However, these mines were all emptied out, and all that was left was 2/3 of Nauru uninhabitable. And by 2001, the economy was left with corruption and they were broke. And that is when the detention center saved them. An important thing that affected their BMI as well as GDP was health. In some age groups, nearly half the population is diabetic, and this was a result when fast food became funded by the wealth earned from the mining. This led them to become the most obese country in the world. According to an article published from The Independent, the most popular dish is fried chicken and cola. Therefore, women's BMI on the graph is the highest than the rest of the world. And so lastly, we'll take a look at the United States, but we'll also show the pattern of the UK and Australia, which stayed on track with the US as well. The obesity epidemic in the 1980s and 90s started, and it did not only target a certain group of the population. Some things that have contributed to this increase is free time and transportation since 1965. And with women entering the workforce, the prevalence of cooking from home has shifted as well. With urbanization, access to fast foods have promoted a change in BMI and income. Since 1980, the reduced time it takes to obtain a meal at a cheaper rate and greater food consumption has been the major cause behind weight gain. There has also been difficulty in self-control, and people go back and forth with their dieting, which imposes the problem with BMI. The UK has faced some similar issues. Another problem is that obesity has started earlier, and the prevalence of overweight and obesity among Australian children nearly doubled since 1980. All three economies are of developed nations, which reflects in their spending power, so a combination of the obesity epidemic and a shift from leisure time and individual transportation has contributed to the rise in BMI in the Western world. Though there have been setbacks in countries in relation to their GDP worldwide, there has been a rise in women's BMI since 1980 that is reflected as the trend of this graph. With such a broad range of data, there are going to be outliers affecting my hypothesis, but overall, women's spending power has an effect on their BMI, has proven to be true.